There's a Canadian federal election coming up on September 20th, and today I have one of the big new names that are running for a seat. Joining me now is Avi Lewis, NDP candidate for BC riding of West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country, one of the longer riding names I've seen. Avi,
Yes.
welcome to the show.
Hey, it's a great pleasure to be here, David.
So we'll get into the election and some big issues that are being debated right now. But first, I want to discuss exactly why your candidacy is such a big deal. So you're an activist, a filmmaker, a former broadcaster for Al Jazeera English, the CBC, and Much Music. You worked with...
Digging deep.
I dig deep.
Luckily, most of that career is pre-internet. Thank goodness.
You worked with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on that fantastic Green New Deal short film. You're married to activist and author Naomi Klein, which I'm sure my audience is very familiar with. And your grandfather is a former NDP leader. Your father is a former leader of the Ontario NDP. So I got to ask you, was this inevitable? Were you always going to run for a seat? What has led you to this point, and why did you decide to get into electoral politics now?
But when you put it all together like that, it seems like a lot. I feel old when you tell me all the things I've done. I come from a political family, and when I was growing up in the early 1970s, my dad and my grandpa were leaders of the Ontario NDP and the federal NDP at the same time, and it was a really exciting time. My grandfather David Lewis brought Justin Trudeau's dad, our current prime minister's dad, Pierre Trudeau, to a minority government in 1972. And he did it with one of the most famous election campaigns in Canadian history. The slogan of his campaign was corporate welfare bums. And it was the beginning. I did a video on the Breach media about this, but it was the beginning of this criminalization of poverty that neoliberalism has been so effective in doing over decades. And the idea of welfare bums was starting to demonize people who were poor and needed help. And he flipped it and just documented all the money that the Liberal government was giving to their corporate buddies and ran a campaign on it. And it tapped into this feeling after Trudeau was elected for the first time in 68 in this huge wave of excitement. People got tired of his arrogance, his entitlement. I'm talking about Justin's dad here.
Yeah.
And he was humbled in that election. And then in the next 2 years, my grandfather holding the balance of power in a minority parliament, like Jagmeet Singh has held the balance of power in this past minority parliament, won a bunch of really important things. A public energy company, Petrocan, was a nationalized, publicly owned energy company. Of course, it was privatized by liberal and conservative governments that followed. Yeah. But imagine now facing the climate emergency, if we had a public company like a major player in the oil patch that could model a managed decline of fossil fuels that took care of workers instead of some of the richest and most powerful corporations. So that kind of model of the NDP playing a really powerful outsized role in our totally corrupt parliamentary system, which should be proportional representation,
yes.
Right? This first past the post thing, we have absolute power for parties with 39% of the popular vote. It's ridiculous. But that was a formative experience for me. But I went into my mom's line of work. My mom was Canada's only second wave feminist newspaper columnist for many, many years in the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. And I got the journalism bug, and I spent a lot of my career. Well, yes, I interviewed rock stars and like John Bon Jovi and the Spice Girls, but also Bowie, and Lou Reed.
Yeah.
But I eventually got into covering politics for young people on Much Music. And then I hosted a debate show on CBC News World at the end of the 90s. And I think for me, it really is the climate emergency that has shoved me out of my comfort zone and into this very weird and frankly vulnerable, odd experience of running for public office. And fundamentally, like my theory of change, we are at a point where, according to the science, we have to slash our emissions at least in half, 60% more in less than a decade. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that network of the world's great climate scientists who advise governments on this emergency, this is a quote from 2018, just cutting emissions enough to have a decent chance at a safe future for people all over the world. We need rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And for those of us who have known all our lives that this system is broken, and it's designed to disproportionately benefit the 1% at the expense of the rest of us, we already know that we need unprecedented change in all aspects of society.
Yeah.
And the climate emergency is not the only one we're facing. We're facing a housing emergency. In Vancouver, The average house price, the benchmark house price went up $417,000 since Trudeau came to power. An entire generation of young people who will never have a hope of owning a home. There's an unnecessary overdose crisis from toxic drug supply. People dying in huge and just heartbreaking numbers, not to mention the pandemic and the public health crisis, where we saw how diminished our public health system was and how unprepared for this health emergency. So we need a Green New Deal. We need to do major, big change in transportation, in housing, in our energy system, in our workforce. We need to put the caring professions, how we care for young people, old people, health and education, all of those low carbon care work is climate work jobs need to be the center of our economy. And that means shifting the whole basis of our society, running it on different values, and doing it all in a very short time. So I've worked in social movements, doing storytelling all over the world for different struggles, people's struggles, and trying to tell those stories to the biggest possible audience. And we need truth telling, and we need big power among social movements, putting pressure on the political class. But we also need accomplices inside, holding the door open to the ingenuity, the creativity, the radicalism of people in struggle. And we just need dual power like yesterday. And I've been really inspired by new Democrat MPs like Matthew Green in Hamilton and Leah Gazan in Winnipeg, who introduced the guaranteed livable income and really in the NDP world, and really built a lot of power behind it, reaching out to movements and building momentum. And now it's in the NDP platform. And, and I feel like there's a Squad North kind of vibe that's waiting to happen. And
Yeah.
I was in the States in 2018 to 2020, worked with AOC, was close to the Bernie political energy and the Squad. And look at the sea change in what's possible to talk about in America today, thanks to a handful of insurgent left politicians who just got elected and started bringing movement style politics and ideas into the political sphere. So sorry for the super long answer, but it's been a lifetime I've been thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I've never wanted to do this before. And now I kind of find myself called to try to play this role.
Well, yeah, that's fantastic, and you touched on a lot of my a lot of my questions actually. But I want
to do that.
That's okay. But I want to get deeper into some of these. So, on the climate crisis, I have a 7-month-old. I know you're a father as well. This is one of these. I mean, it was really one of the questions where, when we were thinking about having a child, we get to think about, what are we bringing our child into? Is he going to be able to live a full, proper life if we are not taking care of our planet? How do you stay optimistic through all this? Because, as you discussed the science, you discussed what we're up against, and we're seeing the results of it right now with the extreme weather that we know is only going to get worse. How do you stay optimistic through all of this? How do you, apart from just addressing this issue, which of course we need to do politically, how do you stay optimistic through all of this? And how do we get to a place where we can actually properly address the climate crisis?
Well, I see you're specializing in the small questions today, and I appreciate you throwing me the softballs that are really
easy one.
I think it's really important to distinguish between optimism and hope. Optimism, I see as the kind of belief that things are going to turn out well. I'm not optimistic, I'll be honest. But hope, I think, is a choice. We can choose to do a kind of politics and live in a way that embodies hope, that we can make things better. And I think hope is a responsibility. There's a huge amount of, especially around climate grief, climate anxiety. Here in British Columbia, the climate emergency is in our throats. Hundreds of fires raging across the country. We have across the province. We have smoke season now. 569 people died in the heat dome, that first heat wave of the summer, directly attributed by the coroner to that extreme heat event driven by climate change. And so that we're in a time of like mass casualty events, thanks to the climate emergency. So yeah, I'm not optimistic. I am hopeful though. And my kid doesn't help because he's 9 and all he wants to talk about is statistics of the conservation status of endangered species.
Wow.
We call him the doom detective. He's doing all this internet research about species that are on the brink. And that is actually kind of hard.
Yeah.
The pandemic has changed everything. The pandemic has laid to rest a bunch of lies of the neoliberal era that has characterized our whole lives. And that's an incredible political opportunity. The government of Canada spent $350 billion in 1 year in pandemic response. Now, they didn't spend that money right. Like they they spent too much of it on Air Canada executives and
Hmm.
share buybacks, giving it to corporations where their executives got extra compensation. I mean, it's like obscene. And the NDP warned them, put strings on that money, otherwise they're just going to take it.
Hmm.
But a lot of it went to people to buy food and pay the rent and actually survive through a state of emergency. So we know that it's a rich country. We know that austerity, the cupboard is bare. We can't afford good social programs. How are you going to pay for it? That whole bullshit
Hmm.
line, right? That we were somehow not able to have fundamental human rights to housing, healthy local food, transportation, zero emissions, everything. Like we know that that was crap. And that is an incredible change in what's possible. And we also know what it's like to live in an emergency. One of the biggest barriers to climate action, and climate activists have been struggling for a few decades now to like communicate that we're in an emergency. And we as humans have this capacity to sort of know things and not know things at the same time. Now, we need to be able to compartmentalize to get through a day. Like when I read the latest IPCC report, like I need to schedule time to lie in fetal position under the
Yeah.
bed for a while because it's like, ah, but, but we're in this period now where we're starting to know what we know. And the pandemic has actually really been a terrifyingly good teacher. The climate emergency is now being felt by people at the surface of our skin. And that, I think, is in part because we're living through this extremely long period, 18 months or more now, where everything in our world has gone upside down. And people used to say, well, the climate, that's far away. No, it's not far away. Well, things don't change on a dime. Yeah, they do. They do change on a dime. They just did. They
Hmm.
still are. Here in BC, they just put the mask mandate for indoor back on,
Hmm.
and we are now living in this prolonged state of emergency. Great. As activists, as politicians, as people on the left, we have an opportunity to translate that to the much greater existential emergency of the climate emergency. And people know what we're talking about when we say this is an emergency. We need big federal government led change that challenges the power of big corporations directly and actually changes all aspects of our lives so that our kids have some kind of future to look forward to. And it feels much closer. There was a poll. I'm not a big fan of like polling and stuff like that, but this one caught my eye. It was last month, I think. It was a major national poll that actually showed that a great majority of Canadians believe that that we will face transformation of our society, deep change in our society as we come out of the pandemic. Fantastic. For those of us on the progressive side of the spectrum, we have to win that change. This is a time to double down. This is a time to get together, connect up all of our networks, all of our different struggles, and push for big change because it's never been so within our grasp. So that's the hope part.
Yeah.
That's the thing that really makes me really feel energized, even about this weird, messy business of electoral politics, which is a totally compromised and broken system. I feel really excited about doing this because people are hungry for big change. And it feels like a moment. I've been doing this for 30 years, working in different kinds of social change movements and just projects. I've never seen a moment like this where it feels so close. So it's a good time to double down.
Yeah, I think you're right to point out that the pandemic and the response to it, I think, has really opened people up to the realization that of how much the government can do for us, how much they can invest, and there is no other downside. I mean, there has to be a big investment into people, into the public, and that also gets us to wealth inequality and the housing crisis. It is as a new father and in a new family, it's impossible for anybody my age to buy a house. How do
Yeah.
we address this? I mean, how do we build wealth? How can we possibly go into the future not having to rent our entire lives? How can the NDP address this? Like, what is the response to wealth inequality and the cost of living?
Okay, so the NDP housing plan is fundamentally different from the other parties in this one essential way. The NDP housing plan actually understands that this is market failure that we're living through. There is a massive speculation bubble that's been fueled by federal government policy. The real estate developers are huge contributors to Liberal and Tories across the country at every jurisdiction. And this has been like a massive speculation spiral that's put housing out of reach for young people. We are not going to solve this with more market mechanisms, with more incentives to builders and developers, or more affordable housing, incentives that the developers just gain.
Hmm.
When was the last time you went out to look for an apartment to rent or a house to buy, or anyone did, that was actually affordable? It isn't. Rent has gone up catastrophically in this period. For average families, like almost $5,000 a year, rent is up in just a very short period. The market is not going to solve this. So the NDP plan, which I think should be even bigger, but it's the biggest one in this way, $14 billion to create 500,000 units of non-market housing, nonprofit housing, co-op housing, co-housing, and public housing. We haven't built public housing in this country since the 1960s.
Hmm.
And it's been abandoned and has been falling apart for decades. That's why public housing has such a stigma in Canada, because they built it in the post-war period. And then the federal government withdrew from any kind of funding for housing in the early 90s, and everything's been crumbling ever since. So we need a massive government investment in switching the building supply. And we can't even wait for all new housing to be built. We need existing housing to be turned from market housing to non-market housing. And the government just simply has to intervene. We're in that level of an emergency. It's been done before in the Second World War in Canada. There have been lots of big public programs, but they have to be led by the public interest. The federal government is the only level of government that has the resources and the power to actually intervene. And the federal government has been retreating from all of our basic social services and housing, most of all, for decades and decades. And the NDP is saying the federal government has to get back into the business of building housing and making housing affordable for people. So I'm really excited about that. And I think we need to go even bigger because, of course, buildings are a big source of greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to be, and the NDP has a plan to retrofit every building in Canada. And that's really important because that creates a lot of jobs in climate work, and saves people money on energy bills and makes the existing housing stock emissions free or lower emissions. So that's a big program as well. But housing has to be part of the climate solution. We need a Green New Deal for housing, and that means addressing multiple crises with big government funded solutions. That's the level of emergency we're at. That's what we got to do.
So let's take a turn a little bit to the ongoing genocide against Indigenous people. Of course, thousands of unmarked graves of Indigenous children have been found on former residential school grounds. It's a reminder of the ongoing genocide against the Indigenous people. What needs to happen now? What should the response be, or what should the response be from the Trudeau government, but also, in general, what should our response be as Canadians and as the Canadian government to this ongoing crisis?
I was sitting with an elder in my community, a hereditary chief and former elected chief named Gary Feschuk of the Shishal Nation near where I live here in Whalequai, otherwise known as Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, a few weeks ago. And we were sitting at the foot of the statue commemorating the kids who were stolen, so that the land and resources could be stolen. And Gary said this thing that was so powerful to me, and I had that like time stop moment. He just quietly said, the truth is coming to the surface. And this is one of those things that we've known for a long time about the unmarked graves all over this land, on the sites of these former so-called residential schools, horror institutions. And the Truth and Reconciliation report had an entire section. This is years ago. Had an entire section on the unmarked graves and the missing children. So we've known about this for so long, and now we can no longer deny it. And that's a different surfacing. That truth is coming to the surface. It's deeply shameful that the Trudeau government is still dragging Indigenous kids through the courts after a Human Rights Commission ruling that the government was discriminating against Indigenous children by not providing equal access to health and education funding. And the Trudeau government is still dragging residential school survivors through court. And the NDP, I'm really proud of Jagmeet Singh. He's been really clear on this. He's been able to clearly name ongoing genocide. No other political leader has done that. And he's been able to say that the NDP would drop those court cases immediately. No more dragging Indigenous people through court. And he's all gone further and said that we would, if the NDP forms government, we would appoint a special prosecutor so that the criminals who were responsible for all of that harm and all of those deaths would face consequences, would be investigated and charged. And I think that's the level of response that's required just for this one piece of the ongoing colonial experiment and crimes. But more than that, I think we have to grapple with how we decolonize our economy, and that's a gigantic thing. But it goes
Yeah.
to the heart of a Green New Deal, and it goes to the heart of every issue, whether it's old growth forests that need to be protected. Not one more old ancient tree should be cut down, except for if they need hard to be harvesting for cultural purposes for First Nations, and the extractive economy, oil and gas, mining. you know, we have this image, this colonial image of good jobs as manly jobs. It's always so gendered, right? Big, tough, manly jobs, taking nature, ripping it out of the ground or out of the water or out of the forests and turning it into money
Hmm.
for shareholders. That's the basis of Canada, which was a company before it was a country. Like when Canada was formed, it was the Hudson Bay Company formed most of the land. It was a corporation before it was a country.
Yeah.
And that corporation was created on extractive principles to take this beautiful, bountiful nature and turn it into money for Europeans. That needs to change. We are, the forests of Canada and even in British Columbia, which used to be one of the great carbon sinks on Earth, absorbing carbon dioxide and offsetting emissions from the industrial economy of the world, the forests of Canada have turned into emission sources. We're now emitting carbon because we've cut down so many trees and because of forest management practices. So the entire extractive economy has to change. And there are concrete solutions for this. And in the realm of Indigenous justice, the NDP has a great proposal in this election platform for a $500 million Indigenous Guardian program. A lot of these, like the battle in the woods that's going on right now over Fairy Creek, in my view, in part, like apart from the specifics, is the fact that for so many places of the resource economy in Canada, it's a zero-sum game. Indigenous communities are offered either a piece of the pipeline pie or the oil and gas jobs or the forestry
Hmm.
jobs or nothing. There's no other offer.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they're trying to have any economic opportunity that they can in trying to do a more responsible version of these traditional extractive energies. This big program, $500 million, would actually create economic development pathways for Indigenous communities in protecting the land instead of further extracting from it. And we desperately need to do that because of species extinction, because of the salmon, that's the keystone species of this entire coastal ecosystem, is in deep, deep crisis. And we need to remediate these streams and fix the watersheds and heal the land. And that has to be the basis of our economy. We launched this thing called the LEAP Manifesto in 2015,
Yeah.
which was like a 10-point plan to get Canada off fossil fuels in a hurry, in a way that actually addresses inequality, racism, and other injustices in our society. And the cut line for the LEAP Manifesto is super relevant today. We need a Canada based on caring for the earth and one another. We have to put care at the center of our economy. And that is especially true for Indigenous communities. And I'm proud that the NDP is starting to get with that program and really propose concrete measures that would do that.
Yeah, speaking of the LEAP manifesto, I mean, it was crazy the amount of shit you guys got for that, and clearly history has proven you correct. It was obvious to many of us at the time, but it's even more obvious now how right you all were to in everything you called for in that. But getting to electoral politics, and so this is the last question here is just there's this sense of skepticism, especially I think among the youth around electoral politics, as we've seen NDP governments in Ontario in early 90s, but also Alberta, that largely once they got to power just sort of went to market-based solutions, went more neoliberal, austerity. How do you ensure that doesn't happen? If an NDP, a federal NDP, were to take power at some point, how do we ensure that this will be a true, left working class NDP and not one that just is pressured by whether it's the mainstream press, whether it's neoliberals within their ranks, whatever it is? How do you ensure that they are continue to be aligned with the working class and against neoliberal politics?
Well, first of all, we don't make promises. We don't ensure. We struggle. We fight. We engage in debate and we push. It's no secret that I've been one of many people who have been trying to push the NDP to the green left, to the environmental left, for many years now. And I think the party really is moving to the left. Jagmeet is in an election campaign, and he's relentlessly talking about what my grandpa talked about in 1972, corporate welfare bumps.
Hmm.
He's pointing out how much money Trudeau hands over to his buddies in the corporate class. He's talking about a wealth tax. He's talking about the pandemic profiteers. the billionaires in Canada who added $78 billion to their wealth during the pandemic and clawing that money back and putting it into universal public services. So look, I'm not going into politics naively. There isn't a political party or a government anywhere on the planet that I think is responding to the climate emergency and all the interconnected emergencies at the level of government response actually required. But that's not to say that so then we shouldn't do it. We're out of time. We need movement pressure. We need allies on the inside. We need better politicians elected. And we need movement people going into politics. And we need others to stay outside because we actually need dual power. There's absolutely no other path to the kind of change, the level of change that we need in the time that we need it. And I'm really encouraged by like folks that I was talking about, Matthew Green and Leah Gazan, but also amazing NDP candidates in this election. Paul Taylor in Parkdale High Park in Toronto is an incredible food justice activist who's on fire about the climate emergency. Anjali Appadurai, who just got nominated in Vancouver Granville, is a hero and comrade in the climate justice movement. She's been working for years in all kinds of climate justice causes. And there's so many young socialists who are running for the NDP and who represent a new wave of energy and radicalism in the party. And it is affecting the party's public positions. Jagmeet is a much more responsive leader than any that I've seen in decades in the NDP. Look at the Palestine resolution. There's been a big fight over getting the NDP to take a stronger stand in favor of Palestinian rights. Convention after convention after convention, activists have been organizing to try to pass something. This past convention, it passed a very important and meaningful resolution calling for an arms embargo on Israel until it complies with international human rights law. And within a couple of weeks, the leader of the party was reading the resolution in the House of Commons as party policy. That's a dynamic where movement folks get involved with a left-wing party, make changes in the party, create pressure within the party, and the party starts to move. And the people in general, especially young people, understand that we need solutions that are actually big enough to solve the crises that we face, and they have to happen fast. And so the zeitgeist is helping us too, in that the party understands that it needs to go further faster, and I think it's starting to do that. David, I want to just end with one little thing, because I keep this book really close to me. This is a book that my grandpa co-wrote with the great socialist poet Frank Scott in 1943, and it was a version of the CCF policy handbook. That the CCF was, of course, the party that preceded the NDP from the 1930s to the 1960s. It turned into the NDP in the 60s. And in this book, which was written at the height of the Second World War, they identify the features of capitalism at the time and talk about what needs to happen. There's a chapter called Political Action for the 99%. And in 1943, my grandpa wrote, the basic struggle today is between the 99% who are reaching out for the economic and political power which the 1% now effectively control. This book was an argument that the federal government take the tactics that it used to scale up Canada's industrial economy to contribute to the Second World War effort, creating 28 public corporations in the course of the war to manage every aspect of the war economy, making rubber, and making planes and tanks, and not stuff that I'm in favor of. I'm a pacifist. I'm not a militarist. But the Second World War was a time when the government actually instructed the corporate sector on what they were going to do, and they planned to change the industrial base of the country, and they did incredible changes in a very short time. And my grandpa was arguing in 1943 that we needed to take that approach, and the government actually standing up to corporations and planning the economy for an emergency, and apply it to the poverty emergency, apply it to the war on poverty and eliminate inequality in 1943. It was incredibly successful. The CCF reached the heights of its political popularity in that time. And we need to do exactly the same thing right now for the climate emergency, for the housing emergency, for the youth unemployment emergency. We know what to do. We just need to build the power on the outside and the accomplices on the inside to push for big change right now. We have no other choice.
Well, that's incredible. I love your enthusiasm. I love your honesty as well. And I mean, your candidacy really is the one for me that stands out this election. I mean, this election for a lot of people, I think is not necessary for a lot of reasons. But I
Yep.
think, having people like you in there would mean a lot, and I think go a long way to changing our politics and pushing us forward. And I thank you so much for coming on. Ivy Lewis, how can people find you online?
Well, the campaign has really been supported by people all over the country with little donations, with people doing phone banking. So, in a time of a lot of digital tools and a pandemic election where we really have to do a lot of politics over the phone, and phone banking is fun. It's actually pretty cool. We get together on Zoom and do it all together. So, there's still some social element. People can go to avilewis.ca and sign up for all kinds of things and throw a few bucks in if you could chip in if you can afford it and yeah, and get involved. We got basically 3 weeks left in this campaign.
Yeah.
So there's a big push. And the day after the election, the movement building and the pressure on the political class has to continue, whether I'm in or whether I'm out. We cannot stop fighting.
Awesome. Well, I'll link to that, your link below the video. And thanks again, Abby, for coming on the show.
That was a pleasure. Hope to be back.